Hello, welcome to this session. In the next 40 minutes we will be talking about malware and how we evaded the behavioral detection of state-of-the-art antivirus and endpoint detection and response solutions with this new flavor of distributed malware, ROP, for ROP-Driven execution. The team behind this research, you might remember me from the last two editions of Black Hat Europe, where I've been talking about malware evasions with first Blue Pill, this framework for disarming malware evasions, and last year instead with new microarchitectural primitives for hypervisor detection. And this is a joint work with Lorenzo Invidia. Lorenzo holds a master degree in cybersecurity from my institution, Sapienza University of Rome, and is really passionate about Windows internals and reverse engineering research. So together we have been working on the problem of how AV and EDR solutions they flag untrusted software as malicious using behavioral analysis. So when you have an untrusted piece of software, what you can do with an AV or EDR solution, you can scan its code and try to match it against known signatures for known threats. But when you're facing a new threat, what you can do is you can attempt behavioral analysis. So it's what is behavioral really? Behavioral is a type of analysis that is dynamic, so it will monitor the execution units in your system for actions involving registry manipulation, file system, network, and so on. And you will try to say if the actions of a process they will match some known patterns, some let's say dynamic execution signatures that are typical of malicious behaviors. The moment that you match such a sequence, the AV or EDR will raise an alert and will ask the user typically what to do and will possibly halt to grind a new threat. So what are the limits of current approaches to behavioral analysis then? This is what we asked ourselves when we started this research. So in this talk I will cover state of the art, what we did to improve it. We'll present this concept ROP, detail its implementation, and two new bypasses which might be of independent interest to get around the mitigations of Windows 10 for the Windows Defender exploit guard component. We will be presenting their experimental results, discuss them, and talk about what are directions for further research in this area and what we can do to defend ourselves from these threats. First, a few more words on behavioral analysis. So you have this infamous untrusted piece of software, and what you do is you start executing it typically on a very tight leash. So you are shepherding every interaction with the operating system, looking for something suspicious. But then at some point you have to let this process go, otherwise you're introducing expensive slowdowns or you might be breaking the functionality. So this application will now run pretty much unleashed after the initial stage, except that you keep an eye on it. You will be still monitoring relevant actions. And to this end, you will be using user space hooks, mini filters, and other standard means. And typically, you do this for one process at a time. So the granularity for looking at events is the actions of a single process. Or sometimes you can extend this to its children. But in general, that's the high-level picture. And researchers have tried to get around heuristic detection of the behavior by using this idea of distributed malware. So to present the concept of distributed malware, a nice work, recent work in the area, use the title of this novel, The Naked Sun, where robots, according to the first law in the novel, they cannot harm humans. They cannot carry a task that will deliberately harm a human. However, what happens is that each robot in the end turns out to make an action that on its own doesn't harm a human. But if you take the outcome of all the aggregated actions, then something bad occurs. And this is what you can do with distributed malware. You take a payload, you can dilute the temporal and spatial footprint of the actions of this payload to multiple cooperating entities, processes, for instance. And the trick is that no single entity alerts the AV or EDR, so you manage to stay below the detection threshold with each unit and you're fine. Fine, so to speak, because in the end, those solutions, the current implementations, they're still an easy prey of AV and EDR solutions because they have some conspicuous traits. There are currently two main approaches to distributed malware. The first is to use a set of processes that you create on the spot, ad hoc, and you can even make this process resemble normal applications like mimicry attacks, but to stay undetected in the presence of state-of-the-art solutions you need a very high number of processes, and also to avoid correlation you should make sure that each process is seen as independent of the other. But if you are all creating them at once, that's a bit difficult to do. I believe that a more promising avenue is the one explored by other researchers that abuse existing processes by taking a payload, chopping this payload in pieces and spreading the pieces of this malware along with an emulator inside victim processes. And these processes are already running on the machine. Typically processes that have lots of activity, so you are literally interleaving malicious activities in a long trace of benign activities. Problems here are that injecting code is noisy. You are introducing or modifying executable memory, and you have both the components of the payload and you have this emulator that coordinates the execution. And you're also introducing quite a number of memory regions because you are retrofitting a normal executable which uses many regions, so does the emulator, so you're introducing lots of artifacts in the address space. And plus there is also another problem now that the problem is the availability of hardening mitigations in operating systems to reduce the attack surface of applications against next generation malware and exploits. So there are in the Windows Defender exploit card, WDEG system, there are a number of mitigations that are opt-in for applications like arbitrary code guard, which prevents the allocation or modification of executable memory. You have code integrity guard that essentially allows you to load only signed modules, signed code modules. And you have mitigations like export and import address filtering that break the usual lookup sequences that injected payloads use to locate APIs. So this is becoming more difficult for distributed malware. And in the end, to realize a successful distributed instance of malware, you might want to have a design that supports a flexible delivery of payload that can work with different injection primitives, where there is limited constraints on the capabilities of the primitive, and at the same time you want to have a very small footprint for the distributed runtime, emulator, or any other component that you need to assist this distributed execution in the coordination. Otherwise you can just fingerprint the emulator. Also you might want to comply with hardening mitigations because those can gain popularity in the next years. At the same time, once you succeed in this, you might also want to keep the code and data of your distributed payload hidden as much as possible to avoid the possibility of dynamic signatures for it on its code. So what we can do? Well, we asked this question to ourselves, and we tried to revisit the architecture of an injection-based distributed malware concept. And we have a loader component that is in charge of injecting a number of victim processes, and we'll inject those victims with a bootstrap component. This bootstrap component will set up the distributed execution where we have a payload that is arranged in chunks, and each chunk can be executed by victims, but the key is that each chunk is expressed using code that is already in the victim. So we are not introducing any code, and to assist the execution with hosting this payload, hosting the memory, so global memory, heap memory, and all the metadata that you need for execution coordination, we use a single medium. We have one medium, and one memory region to host everything at once. And for this, we use a non-inspectable covert channel. In more detail, the two main ingredients of our architecture are return-oriented programming and transactional NTFS. With this combination, we realize a distributed ROP-driven execution that we called ROP. In more detail, return-oriented programming, well, if you don't know, return-oriented programming, it's a well-known exploitation technique that reassembles code fragments that are in the address space of an application to carry out the desired semantics for an attacker. But you can do a lot more than exploitation. So in our case, we use ROP to encode the distributed payload using ROP gadgets that are in some code module that all the victims have loaded. And by doing so, we avoid the need of having writable and executable memory. At the same time, we will use ROP also to get around some of the mitigations of WDAG. The other ingredient is transactional TFS. So this is an abstraction available in Windows that allows you to perform transient changes to the contents of a file on the file system. And unless you commit these changes, only processes that have a handle to an NTFS transaction can see those modifications that you made. Not even an antivirus can. So with this, we obtain an unexpectable covert channel, and in this covert channel, we will place the payload, and we will also orchestrate the communications between the entities. And this is possible also because with ROP, the code that we need to write is just data. So we have one big region inside this TXF file. And now let's analyze each component of the architecture in detail. We have the loader. The loader is responsible, first of all, for selecting suitable victim processes. So you may want to start, for instance, for picking processes that are active on the network, if you need to exchange information over the network, applications that have high file system activities. So you might follow some criteria. Then what you do is you prepare an NTFS transaction. So you take some file, or you create one. You create a transaction on it. We will call this file the ROP-TXF. Then you can just empty any content that is in there, and you will place there the ROP chains and the metadata. And then what you do is you will duplicate a handle to the transaction for each victim process. So the victim can look into this transient content. And then in the end, once you've achieved all this step, you will inject a component in the victim along with a copy of this transacted handle, the specific per victim copy. The bootstrap component that you're injecting is in charge of making the victim load the transacted file, the ROP-TXF. And the victim will fetch the contents that are needed from the file to schedule the execution of ROP code, and will arrange coordination with other victims when this is necessary. And also the bootstrap component will help in the covert resolution of the APIs that are needed for the functioning of the malware. A few more words on the transacted file. So we are arranging the payload as a sequence of chunks, and each chunk can be executed independently. So each victim will execute one or more chunks over time, and chunks are placed in the ROP-TXF alongside their memory. So program memory will be part of the transacted file, globals, heap, everything will be in there, along with metadata for the ROP runtime. So the addresses of the APIs that we have located in a covert manner, but also handles that you need. For instance, when processes, they have to work on the same objects, each process will need to work on its own handle. Think of a socket or a file. So we have provisions for that too. And we support two execution modes. One, we call it continuous. By that we mean that really any victim can execute any chunk. We just need to preserve the order and the mutual exclusion so that every chunk gets executed by exactly one victim. And so we provide coordination with ROP. And we have a staged mode where we can have that sequences of chunks are to be run by specific victims. So if you have, for instance, some downloading phase, dedicated chunks for downloading stuff, for sending stuff to the internet, those might better be run by network active process. And in these cases, you might also have that coordination might be delegated to the payload or can still be provided by ROP. With this design, we are getting a number of advantages. We don't need to allocate or modify executable memory. We use just one shared medium for code and data, no many regions like before. We comply by design with ACG and CIG. And also we are making in-memory inspection harder for AV and EDRs, because in the end, if they try to look at what we have injected in those victims, they will find a bunch of gadget addresses and data. They will not find code, because ROP adds one level of indirection to the execution. So you need ROP-aware analysis to look for actual instructions. But now I have to convince you that this actually works and how we made it work. So there are a number of challenges that we should be discussing, and we will start with the injection of the bootstrap component, because I promised that there will be no writable and executable memory, but also we have to talk about a gadget source. So actually we thought of a way of addressing the first two challenges at once. And in doing so, in the whole implementation, actually, we had to come up with two novel bypasses for the mitigations of WDAG. So I will be covering this now. Let's start with the first bypass. But the problem that we have to face is that we need to deliver this bootstrap component to victims, and at the same time we need to make sure that all victims, they share a gadget source that is good enough for supporting the execution of our payload. So this has to meet the following constraints. We can only use signed code modules, no writable and executable memory, and most importantly, we should not spook an AV or EDR with conspicuous actions. What we can do? Well, at first we thought of phantom DLL hollowing, which up to last year was the only documented injection that could get around code integrity guard. The idea of phantom DLL hollowing is to take a Windows DLL, create a transaction on it, and then you can change the contents of this DLL as you want. So you can place stuff in there, for instance the bootstrap component, then you write those changes in a transaction, and you create a section object. So you use Windows primitives for creating a section, and then you can force the victim processes to map this section in their memory. So you're forcing the victims to load them. Problem is now all the state-of-the-art solutions pretty much they're monitoring this kind of behavior. We also thought that we could be instead creating the section directly from the victim, because if the victim does that, maybe it's not that suspicious. Problem is with recent updates from the end of last year to WDAG, if you try to do NT-create section from a process that is CIG enabled, you will get this error. So you will get invalid image hash. What to do then? Well, our bypass works like that. We still create a transacted file on a Windows DLL. We change the contents for placing extra stuff in there, and we create a section. Then what we do is we duplicate a handle to the section for our victims, and we inject a ROP chain in the victim, so that the victim will map this section with their own handle. And also we are resuming the own activities of the victim. So it will be a one-off thing. We will quickly interrupt the execution and map our transacted DLL and resume the normal activities. In more detail, we use a very simple ROP chain. In total, it's 5 gadgets of 1 instruction each. that will set up the arguments for nTmap view of section. So we'll call nTmap view of section from within the victim on the handle, and we'll parse the output, so the address where this module is loaded, and we'll combine this with the offset of the code that we want to run inside the module. And what happens actually is that the chain also contains a context object with the CPU registers that the victim, that they were a part of the on activities of the victim when we interrupted it. And so we will run the desired code, and upon return from this code, the ROP chain will take over, call NT continue, and restore this context. With this technique, we just obtain multiple advantages at once. First of all, we can add all the gadgets that we want to DLL. So if we don't have enough gadgets, or we want gadgets that are easier to work with, we have that. We can place the bootstrap component inside the DLL. So we can use a ROP chain, or we can even write this as a shellcode if we want. And we will have that the victim will be loading this DLL. So all the victims can load the same DLL. And actually, the victim will spawn the execution of the payload that we want. There will be no remote thread, no remote APC. We will just have that. In the implementation, we use an initial sequence that creates a thread, so a normal internal thread, and we'll return to the ROP chain immediately, and with NT continue, the execution will resume. With that said, this is just an implementation shortcut. You take any other injection primitive, ROP should work fine. With this, we just gained a lot of time in the implementation. And we complied with we met the first few challenges. Now we also have to comply with ROP mitigations because WDAG is offering also mitigations for ROP. You have stack pivot, which checks the range of the stack pointer when you invoke a sensitive API. So what we do is we make API calls from the native stack. We switch stacks. And then there's caller check and SIMexec, which validate the call site and the return site of APIs. Here we didn't really invent anything new. There are gadgets that break those analysis, there's rite of passage, or in case you use a shellcode for the bootstrap component, you can issue calls from there, and this will be fine for those mitigations. We observed that a flaw in the WDAG ROP mitigations is that while they shepherd and they create section or create file mapping, those APIs, they just ignore nTmap view of section. So our injection, our bypass for ACG and CIG will go unnoticed also by the ROP mitigations of Windows. Fourth challenge, we have to deal with drop encoding. So we have a malware, and we really don't want to write ROP code for this malware because it won't scale. I mean, writing ROP code can be fun, but it's demanding, and existing tools, they're meant for exploitation mostly. They don't bring full expressivity for writing ROP programs. We wanted some automation, so we obtained some in the end. We borrowed some ideas from prior research, such as ROP Injector, which was presented at Black Hat a few years ago. And we used the standard Visual Studio compiler with specific compilation settings to simplify the structure of the code. Then what we did is, since we don't want to mess with the stack because we have the chain on there, we are removing all stack variables and we are promoting them to global variables. Actually, all the global variables will be part of a single big data structure. They will be just fields. And this works fine as long as you don't have recursion. This works fine. The reason is that then when we need to look up this information in memory or in the file, we can just do relative displacement. We just need to take the address of this data structure and compute displacements for our access. So that's handy. We obtain an output that is like a shellcode, simple shellcode. And we look up basic blocks in there. Each basic block will become a chunk, and we will look up gadgets that are suitable for destruction in every basic block. We will build some sorts of chain skeleton that is almost complete, and we will complete it by hand. For future work, we are thinking of using the raindrop obfuscator that recently became available, which supports fully automated drop binary rewriting. So there are some extensions to do, like to comply with the ROP mitigations of Windows, or even to support Windows binaries, because it's for Linux, but it's very promising, and we would like to do that for the future. And finally, one more challenge to deal with is the lookup of APIs in victim processes that are hardened against those lookups. And so here it comes our new bypass. But looking up APIs is needed both in the bootstrap component and of course in the chunks. So the malware might also decide to use all sorts of APIs, and you need flexibility in this sense. If you use get procedure address, then you're alerting an AV or EDR, so it's not an option. You can say, okay, I will be importing or solving all the APIs from the loader component, but this will be suspicious and you will give away lots of information. And normally what you do is, you deploy your own get proc address sequence, but there are double-deck defenses that break those codes. There's export address filtering and import address filtering. Those mitigations, they work in a very similar manner. They monitor accesses that you make to the export or import address table of a PE module that is loaded in memory. They do that by using a guard page. So at the moment that an instruction access this region, you will have an exception. The handler will kick in and will allow the access if this instruction is coming from a legit module. Well, this wouldn't be a Black Hat talk without a meme. So legit module, this is where the shoe pinches, because what you can do is you can take any legit Windows DLL, which is already in memory, and you find a gadget in there that can make an arbitrary read. So you need a gadget that just can read from an arbitrary address. And what you do every time you have to access a guarded region, so for instance the export address table, you use the gadget for dereferencing that memory, because the moment you do, for the guard page handler, it will see, oh, it's from kernel 32, so that's fine. And so you have your bypass. You might also use JOP for that. We did that, jump-oriented programming. We also use that for another proof of concept for import address table hijacking. Very quickly, so if you have your code that, for instance, is looking up the list of names, what you can do is you can wrap the access to the sensitive part here in this C code by using this procedure, which is really simple. You prepare the address for where you want to read, you call the gadget, and you read the result. It's simple as that. So now we have ticked all the boxes for the challenges. Let's evaluate ROP on state-of-the-art solutions to see if it works, and we consider 10 products, 6 antiviruses and 4 EDRs. We consider all the available mitigations that are obtained on WDEG plus the system defaults. We target victim applications running with medium integrity level, and we inject them with payloads that would alert an AV or EDR if you run them standalone, but in ROP they should be protected, and we will see if it's the case. And we also make a comparison with DTime, which is the state-of-the-art in distributed malware based on injection techniques. In more details, WDEG mitigations, they have there are some implementation flaws or incompatibilities. We run them in audit mode, and we consider different combinations for when a mitigation cannot be used with another. But in general, our ROP concept is meant to deceive the high-level idea. So we want to deceive even a perfect implementation of this countermeasure, and we want to do that using the smallest number of victims as possible to really stress the approach. So with 2 victims, we are really pushing the boundaries of distributed instead of taking many processes for diluting this payload. And in particular, we test 2 payloads, one for the continuous execution mode, and in this case we are either modifying the Windows registry to achieve persistence, or we play with the boot sequence of Windows. And in the other case, we do the stage mode, where we have a download and execute sequence. So one victim, like a browser, we download a PowerShell script, and another victim will execute the script. And what are we going to get? Surprise, surprise. Well, we deceived the products 8 out of 10 without triggering any mitigations of WDAG. For the 2 products that were not completely deceived, we noticed that they blocked our attempt to do open process, even though our process was entitled, had the rights. And we also noticed that these antiviruses were giving fake outputs to duplicate handles. So this is nothing new really for people that do AV reverse engineering. So, and you can work around these problems with other off-the-shelf techniques. But the important message here is also that state-of-the-art approaches like D-time, they are detected by, in this case, by 7 products. What we learned from our experiments is that evading user mode API hooks is not really necessary, was necessary only for 1 product, was blocking the injection stage, but we were able to deceive using the Windows and Windows 64 APIs. We didn't even try the direct system calls, for the record. And only the injection stage is fragile because it's not distributed. For the distributed payload, we didn't evade the API hooks. We also learned that these mitigations like export address filtering or import address filtering, they're promising. They can break many injection patterns when they start to the payloads look up APIs, but they can be deceived. So we believe there is more work needed there. And more importantly, we think that ROP, it's apparently delivered a blindside hit to these products. And if you want to mitigate ROP by fixing individual aspects, like I will block ROP, or I will block transacted files, or I will disallow the thread creation, you can try other means, so other code reuse flavors, other covered mediums, or instead of creating an internal thread, you can schedule an APC. There are more opportunities. This can be interesting also for fileless research. So we believe that it's necessary for distributed malware to have defenses that see the threat as a whole and not just try to mitigate the individual symptoms. To this end, we believe that behavioral analysis should strive to correlate execution units. This is easier said than done, because in the end, if you try to analyze many processes as a whole, well, you face scalability issues. You might face a lot of information that you have to process and to correlate, and also to understand when processes are related to each other. You should keep track of all the injection techniques that keep appearing. So what we suggest instead is that you can follow the duplication of objects, handles, and the sharing of objects. This seems promising because in the end, to support a distributed execution, you will need to use standard operating system means for handles and objects for their duplication. So this can be promising. Also, we believe that code reuse aware analysis will be interesting, an interesting addition for in-memory scanning, in-memory analysis of antiviruses. There are some works in the academic literature that are promising. And we also think that it's important to invest in technologies that allow to robustly intercept an AV or robustly intercept the invocation of sensitive APIs, that you cannot just bypass the hooks. So there are opportunities like event tracing of Windows, or breakpoints that are implemented using extended page tables. There are many opportunities. I hope you enjoyed our research and enjoyed this talk. There is also a paper that is detailing our concept. If you're interested, you can look at it, and most importantly, I will be very happy to take your questions and answer them now. Thank you for your attention.